Kevin Brady, President of the American Institute for History Education, and I would like to welcome you here to AIHE TV at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. Our guests today that we have are Peter Ernest, who is a former senior executive with the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, and the executive director of the museum, and also Major General Oleg Kalugin, who was a executive with the Soviet Foreign Intelligence Service, also known as the KGB in the United States, and he was the head of the KGB operations in our country. Mr. Ernest, can you tell us why is it critical, or do you think it is critical, for students today to study the Soviet-American rivalry over the last 50 years, and especially why students should study about espionage and spies and the relationships between those?
Sure. Well, I think there are several things there. One is in studying the relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States over the last number of years, particularly through what is called the Cold War. I think it's important always for students, young or old, to have a sense of their past. Where do things come from? Because nothing starts brand new. There's always a history to it. There's roots to it. And I think in the case of understanding the Cold War, understanding that relationship, I would take a sentence out of President Obama's speech in accepting the Nobel Prize, that we need to see the world as it is, not as we would like it to be. So I think it's important that at a time when there are so many attempts to label things one or another, that it's good to look at things with the idea of understanding them. Why was there this rivalry? It didn't come from nowhere. What was the nature of it? Did it actually bring us close to nuclear war, as some people have said? And to what extent did espionage or intelligence writ large, so I don't mean just spies, but overhead reconnaissance and other things, to what extent did that play a role in how the Cold War went and how it turned out? I think those things are critical for a student to then take on the 21st century and his or her own time and why things are happening the way they do, and that, after all, is why we study history.
Well, let me add to what Peter has just said. The Cold War was essentially a war of ideologies, I would say, of two political and economic systems in which the Soviet Union at that time presented itself as the future of humanity, based on Marxist theories that socialism, communism will eventually prevail and triumph. That what the Soviets, after the World War II, in which Russia emerged as a victorious nation, and that added to Russian ambitions to challenge the United States, which also emerged in the world as the #1 international entity, and challenged the Soviet claims to the future of humanity. So that was the essence of the Cold War, ideological war in the first place, but also with many other elements of the war, short of regular war. But regular war at that time was really beyond understanding of the people. We would inevitably get into a nuclear conflict. And that's what stopped the Soviets and the United States from a regular war, which would, I say, be a disaster for the whole of humanity. The Cold War was, in effect, an attempt to weaken the Western world and to eventually advance the Soviet cause across the world. We actually, after World War II, moved to Eastern Europe. We occupied Eastern Europe. We tried to win friends all over the world, and the emergence of the Chinese People's Republic on the east made Russia feel that we are on the right track. And some other nations later in Africa, and then the appearance of Cuba, that all showed in the right direction according to the Soviet political, theories and political figures who believed this is the advance of a Soviet socialist system across the world, and the United States has to be treated as enemy #1. That was precisely the definition of the United States at the peak of the Cold War, enemy #1.
I think it's important for folks to understand that the Soviet Union at the time was a tremendous military and political force in the world. And among the most formidable weapons that the Soviet Union had was the ideology it was promoting, which, yes, was socialism, as General Kalugin explained, but it was communism, which is a pure ideology which the Soviet Union was promoting around the world and in our country. And so we weren't just concerned about a political military entity, the Soviet Union, but we were also very concerned about the spreading influence of communism, where it was taking root, where it was galvanizing people to enter into revolution in their own countries, certainly Cuba being an example. Today we're dealing in some cases with forces which manifest themselves in the form of terrorism, and in some cases they're not states, but they exercise a weapon called terrorism, and they are also, in exercising terrorism, actually targeting Americans and others in what I would call the democratic world as targets specifically to kill. And I think it's important to understand that whereas General Kalugin and I were representatives of different systems, we were not seeking to assassinate one another. Our systems were in conflict, and each of us did something on behalf of our systems against the other. Propaganda, trying to recruit people and so forth, but not specifically the idea of what I would call terrorist activities. And I think that's an important distinction to make between what we dealt with in the Cold War and what we're dealing with today as we do this discussion.
General Kalugin, can you tell us some of the various institutions in the United States that the KGB had infiltrated, maybe things like the media, the churches, government?
At the peak of the Cold War, before the collapse of the USSR, actually in the 40s and 50s, to be more precise, the Soviet intelligence had assets in every sphere of American public and government life. We penetrated the United States government in the former Office of Strategic Services, the precursor of the CIA. We had some 26 sources. Well, in fact, by 1953, the Soviet intelligence handled more than 300 sources in the United States in every sphere of American life, in science, national economy, government, federal government, local governments. And the United States did not have a single spy inside the USSR. So the score was 300 to 0 before 1953.
But I think what is important for us to understand here is that in the run-up to World War II, when the Soviet Union was promoting communism throughout the world, seeking to spread its influence through its own agents, we did not have, in the run-up to World War II, any sort of national intelligence organization. We only developed one as a country during World War II, and that was the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, and that carried out sabotage and other operations in Europe and in the Pacific. After World War II, it was when after OSS had been dissolved, our leadership realized we need to have some sort of national organization that lets us know what is happening in the world on a regular basis, because we never wanted another Pearl Harbor to happen, a surprise attack, and we wanted to know as much as we could about the other world and who was seeking to carry out subversion or operations in our country. And that's when the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, was created in 1947. That became the premier organization for taking information from other mechanisms we had, analyzing it, and giving it to the policymakers, being the President, Secretary of State, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So in looking at those numbers, we had 0 agents, that is assets, if you want to call them, in Moscow, in the Soviet Union. We didn't even try. During World War II, the Russians, the Soviets, were our ally. So we did not spy against them. There was no effort. We were not trying to export an ideology such as communism. Yes, we were for democracy, and we promoted that, but not in a subversive way. And that was the difference between the two systems. That is, the Soviet Union was seeking, by subversion and secret agents, to both extend its influence and promote communism. We were not trying to do that. We did not have such an agency until the CIA in 1947, and so our efforts at even creating agents of the kind that General Kalugin's talking about were nil up until that point.
General, I had heard you speak before of what would possibly have happened if Henry Wallace had become president instead of Harry Truman, or if FDR had passed away before the election of 1944, and talking about other that the Soviets had people planted in the United States government, and what effect would that have? Can you elaborate on that some?
The Soviet Union and its intelligence services took advantage of the defeat of Germany and Soviet triumph to promote the Soviet system as the most promising and most attractive. And since the United States emerged after World War II as the only adversary, I mean, one which would stand in the way of Soviet designs on the world domination. So the United States would become inevitably enemy number one. And the Soviet intelligence did all it could to undermine the prestige, the American system, the role of America in World War II, and of course, to picture the United States as an imperialist nation which wants to dominate the world and exploit mercilessly the poor people in the third world countries. Actually, the appeal was primarily to the developing nations, because once the Soviets were stopped in Europe, when they hoped they would go all the way after World War II, I mean, in the wake of the defeat of Germany, all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. But, well, the involvements of the Western nations since the Normandy, sort of landing of the Western troops fighting Germany, we actually was stopped and Germany was divided. Austria remained for a while a piece of sort of split into several parts. America's determination to stop the Soviet expansionism was indeed accompanied by nuclear developments, and it was clear for the Soviets that if we go further in our efforts to expand the Soviet empire, there may be a nuclear disaster. Actually, the Cuban crisis of the early 60s, when the Soviets tried to install some intermediate range missiles on the Cuban territories, and that attempt was thwarted by the United States, and John F. Kennedy at that time took a very tough stand, and Khrushchev tried to scare the people of the United States by talking about Soviet dominance in the intercontinental missile area, but he was bluffing. And one of the American sources at that time, who had access to the military secrets, provided the true picture of the Soviet military standing. And that allowed President Kennedy and the United States government to take, vigorous actions to stop turning Cuba into a major military base for the USSR. So that penetration of critical, really, nature in the Cold War business and subsequent successes of the CIA really made it impossible for the Soviets to, carry out the plans and designs they had worked on for decades. Well, with the collapse of the USSR, all these plans and designs, just simply collapsed altogether.
Mr. Ernest, what can you tell some of our audience who and teachers really like to hear this, and the students, what your role was in the CIA and some interesting stories that you may want to share with them?
Well, I think that one of the things that I often get asked is how I came to join the CIA, how I came to be in the CIA. I got out of Georgetown University, having studied history and government, with the idea probably of going into law or the Foreign Service. I served a period in the military, at which time I was approached by the CIA. I was then serving in Japan with the Marine Corps. And none of us knew anything about the CIA because the movies and the books and television, it simply was not a subject. I mean, it was a sort of a hush-hush subject. And so I was given to understand by the people that recruited me that it had to deal with our involvement in what was the early years of the Cold War, confronting the Soviet Union, concerns about communism. So as they say, it seemed like a good idea at the time. So I joined, and it became a 35-year career. It was a wonderful career. I felt very much at the front lines of what my country was about. For us in the agency and other intelligence places, we did feel we were at war. It's called the Cold War, but there were conflicts around the world, whether it was Korea or Vietnam and eventually Afghanistan and so forth. These were hot wars, but there were also influence operations and so forth. In the CIA, I was in what is called today the National Clandestine Service. That is the part of the CIA that deals with secret operations, both recruiting agents to gain information, as well as what we call covert action, and that is influence operations, all the way from propaganda to helping the special forces in Afghanistan. That was about 25 years of my 35-year career. And I think this is good for young people to know, is that I also had the opportunity then to serve in other capacities. I was with our Inspector General for about 2.5 years. I headed up our staff dealing with the U.S. Senate, the oversight committees. I helped oversee support to the trials of the spies in the 1980s, the so-called decade of the spy. And I was eventually the director of media relations, dealing with all the press and authors and so forth, for the agency, and spokesman. And that was for 3 directors. Jim Woolsey, who's now on our board here, Judge William Webster, who had headed, the only man to head the FBI and the CIA, who's also on our board, and Bob Gates, who's now the Secretary of Defense. And it was a privilege to serve with all of them. It was an extraordinary experience, and I cannot recommend a career in intelligence highly enough in terms of serving your country and sort of being at the front lines of seeing where things were going on.
General Kalugin, how about you? Can you tell our audience, what you had done for the KGB in the United States, and relate some experience and stories with some people like Gorbachev and Yeltsin, and also maybe tell a little bit about your experience with Boris Yeltsin in front of the tanks that were rolling down the streets of, or stopped in the streets of Moscow?
Well, I joined the KGB as a volunteer in 1952 after graduation from high school. And I spent 6 years in training under the auspices of the KGB. I studied international relations, 3 foreign languages, history of the regions I was supposed to get involved with, I mean, as a spy. In 58, when I graduated finally, with Arabic as my main language, and I was supposed to go to Egypt, my first assignment abroad. Abruptly, my trip was cancelled, and I was offered to come to the United States as a Fulbright scholar. So that changed my career dramatically. I came to Columbia University School of Journalism, where I spent a year, and I was featured in the New York Times at that time because I was elected to the Students' Council of Columbia University, the first student ever elected to the any student body of the United States university, I mean. And that propelled my career, and partly also because when I was a student, I recruited my first source in the United States with access to classified information. It was accidental almost, but I took advantage of the guy's willingness to share with the Soviets the knowledge and classified information, and even solid fuel for missiles, which at that time was of crucial importance in the space race between the USSR and the United States. Later I came back again to the United States as a Radio Moscow correspondent. That was my new cover, consistent with my background, School of Journalism. And for 4 years, I've been involved in the recruitment process in New York City, as well as special disinformation operations, which would make the United States government look as criminal and totally corrupt. And we took advantage of the US media. I mean, the freedom of the press in this country allows you to manipulate and make stories much more fancy and damaging to the United States as a society and the government. So that's what I was involved in for several years. Later, in '64, I had to go back home because of the defection of one of the KGB officers. And I thought I would never come to the United States. But then again, my record was pretty good, and I was suggested to go back now as deputy chief of KGB operations in the United States with my base in Washington, the press officer of the Soviet embassy in the United States. And in this capacity, I handled a few interesting cases. Particularly one from the National Security Agency, Robert Lipka, a guy who volunteered and offered, bags, literally, of information stuffed from the National Security Agency, where he was supposed to destroy these papers, and he would pass it to the Soviet intelligence. But perhaps the most important case in my career in Washington was that of John Walker, a man who worked for the Naval Cryptographic Division. And as a result of his work, we managed to obtain the codes of the United States military. And for many years, decoded thousands of pieces of classified information. And John Walker himself built a sort of a family of spies, including his son and his son-in-law. So that was one of the most remarkable parts of my career. But I actually stood at the inception of that program. Walker's case. But that propelled my career again. And when I came back to Moscow, I was promoted 2 steps over normal promotion, became deputy and then chief of foreign counterintelligence with nearly 700 officers under my command. But perhaps more important for my own record, when I took over, we had about 180 foreign sources, primarily in intelligence and counterintelligence of the world. By the end of my stint in that organization, we had 500 sources. Well, in fact, when I was relieved of my duties in the intelligence and sent to the domestic service as number 2 man in St. Petersburg's field office, that really turned me around. I was a convicted and dedicated communist, but I worked against the West, and I knew the West pretty well. Now my job was to investigate my own people who were unhappy and wanted a change. And I had to put them either in psychiatric institution or jail because they would not be willing to play along. So that turned me away totally from the Soviet system, and I was the first in the KGB to speak honestly about the problems we had. And Mr. Gorbachev, who came to power and actually encouraged me and many other people by saying that it's time to open our society and to tell the truth to the world and to ourselves. And that's what I did. I took Gorbachev literally. Well, probably a little prematurely. Well, anyway, I became a public critic of the KGB. And Mr. Gorbachev stripped me of my rank and decorations. I was nearly put in jail, but I was saved from imprisonment by the people of Russia. I was elected a member of the Soviet Parliament, obtained immunity from prosecution, and this new capacity as a political figure, I would travel around the world and to talk about the need of total dismantling of the Soviet system. Well, as Yeltsin emerged as a political leader, and Gorbachev lost control of the country, the Soviet Union fell apart, and well, Yeltsin became the president of Russia, independent sovereign country. I was offered the job of the KGB chairman. I refused. I was a political figure. I did not care anymore about the KGB. And in that capacity, I remained active until '95, when it was clear that the Yeltsin, who was an honest but erratic man, unpredictable in some ways, well, drinking too much, that spoiled many things around him, and the idea of reforms was also viewed by many as launched by a man who was not sober. Well, that led to my decision to accept an invitation. I was involved in business at the time. Gorbachev totally rehabilitated me. I was involved in business, and we launched a major joint venture in the United States with AT&T. And I came to the United States in '95 for a 3-year contract. I did not plan to stay here forever. I had family, everything back home, I mean. And well, but things started to change in Russia after Yeltsin's retirement. My former subordinate, Lieutenant Colonel Putin, became director of the Russian Security Service at some point. And he publicly stated, once he became the director, he called me traitor publicly. I called him a war criminal, and I said that he will face the International Court of Justice, just like Mr. Milosevic of Yugoslavia, for the atrocities committed against the people of Chechnya. So that was the beginning of my rupture, I mean, with the current regime. And I, remained beyond the 3-year contract with AT&T. And my friends told me, don't come back home because you may be jailed or whatever. So I stayed here. I did not plan to stay forever, but in 2001, after the attack on the United States by the terrorists, when President Bush looked into the eyes of Mr. Putin, and they read each other's souls, and I felt a little uneasy and nervous about my future, but well, nothing happened. And in the end, with the Putin administration totally in control of the country, I faced a choice, and I chose to stay in the United States and eventually applied for citizenship, which was granted to me, and that was the greatest event in my life.
We're so pleased that General Kalugin also agreed to become a member of our board. And he has been one of the strongest members of our board in understanding intelligence and its role in national security, whether it was his former country or this country. And we're very pleased he got his citizenship.
Thank you, Peter.
I would say, too, that he is a resource for our country because he has continued to be available to speak out publicly, whether it's interviews or to groups, teachers, and so forth. So he has become for us, I think, an asset, a national asset. And during the period that I was in CIA, my initial involvement was that of what is called a clandestine services officer. We call those case officers or operations officers. And I went through a period of training. It's an area we call the farm, frequently referred to in literature. But you deal with many things, whether it's how to spot surveillance, how to conduct surveillance, recruiting people to become assets, and it's very, very important learning to communicate well, writing reports, speaking, understanding information quickly. And when I completed that, I was then went out very quickly to the field. I spent virtually all of my time, which was 11 years, overseas in Europe and in the Middle East. During those periods, I was under one form of cover or another. That means that when I was in the field, as we call it, I was not identified as a CIA officer. I was identified as perhaps some sort of U.S. official or an independent businessman of some kind. And in that capacity, I was involved in meeting people to determine if they might be willing to become covert, that is secret, assets, sources for the American government, obviously through the CIA and through me. So that was a fundamental, that was an important part of what I did. The other part of what I did, I was deeply involved in covert action operations, particularly concerning the Soviet Union. And that is, we were trying to send materials into the Soviet Union. We were supporting radio broadcasts. We were sending in individual agents. We were publishing materials. We would do the same thing later in helping East Europe free itself. We would help the Polish Solidarność, the Solidarity movement. So those were the kinds of specific things that we did. And you have to understand that when I say I recruited people as sources of information, you also have to recruit people, and we call them our agents. You also have to recruit people to conduct covert action. In other words, if you are going to influence a publication, perhaps you have to recruit a reporter on that publication or an editor on that publication. So I was involved in that in a broad number of things. This was the beginnings of some of our modern terrorism. I did handle a major terrorism figure. I also was responsible for, later in my career, handling the resettlement of the highest ranking individual from the Soviet Union, a man named Shevchenko, Arkady Shevchenko, who was then a very senior officer in the UN, a Deputy Undersecretary General. And he had been an agent of ours for some 2 years in New York at the UN, defected, and then we needed to both protect him. We were concerned that the Soviets might seek to take action against him, and then to help him resettle in this country. And so all of those things that I did operationally became very valuable for me when I then represented the agency on the Hill and with the media, because I had, as it were, been there and done that. I knew what I had to represent. So I think my career involved such different facets that was what made it so interesting. There is nothing that we take more strongly in the museum here than our educational mission. Mm-hmm. And so both for the schools who visit here in considerable numbers, even individual students, we have workbooks and so forth for them to use in understanding the artifacts and understanding the story we're telling at the museum. But one thing we have focused on in the past couple of years, and we have just published, by the way, a publication called Minute by Minute. And this is a publication designed for use either here at the museum with teachers or students here, or even offsite, because I have gone offsite with our staff members and trained with this edition. It is a remarkable work because what it does is take the Cuban Missile Crisis as a case study, and the students actually work their way through it. That the instructor presents the crisis as it arose and said, all right, now here is the crisis. Here is the building evidence of the Soviet buildup in Cuba. Photographs, CIA documents that are classified, overhead photographs by U-2 airplanes and the Air Force, and we then ask the students to analyze the situation and see what they can understand and what they would advise policymakers if they were put in the position of seeing this evidence and advising policymakers, because that's what intelligence does. That's the role of intelligence. And so we've been very pleased with this. As I said, here's another booklet just to show you, and that again is a booklet designed for school groups that come here, and it's a combination workbook and narrative of some spy information, anecdotal in nature. But I think this idea of taking this out to teachers, out to students, or here is something we've really embraced. We are also looking at making this available through distance learning. So that'll be our next step in expanding our educational reach.
Excellent, Peter. I want to say that I have read these materials as a former high school teacher and college, in college professor. I think they're phenomenal. We are going to be using this material in some of our professional development so that we can make sure that teachers get this, that students have this material, and we are going to be bringing students and teachers to the Spy Museum to be able to go through and experience the fabulous, fantastic exhibits that you have here. And we've been doing that for the past few years, and right now schools are lining up and teacher organizations are lining up to come here.
Well, the other thing they can do, Kevin, is they can go directly to our website, which is www.spymuseum.org, and they can download lesson plans on things like terrorism in America, which is our traveling exhibit right now. So they can go to the website and see what is available. This, of course, is available when when we are teaching, either here or outside. It's also available in our retail outlet here at the museum.
Gentlemen, I'd really like to thank you for these marvelous stories, and I strongly encourage teachers to give students the opportunity to investigate the Cold War, to investigate espionage, and to investigate and learn about heroic spies that have phenomenal tales like this that have taken place over the last 40, 50, 60 years. And I'd also like to strongly encourage teachers and everybody out there to come to Washington, D.C. to see this phenomenal museum and to go to the website at www.spymuseum.org for materials that you can use in your classroom or you can use with your children. Thank you very much, and we'll see you again on AIHE TV.